Hello everyone and welcome back. So we're going to look at a little workflow of certain images that I've taken in the past. Now this subject in this chapter, we're going to go on forever with it. We're always going to be posting new styles, new tricks, new edits to apply to different images. There's really no real workflow as people often put it. Quite honestly, I think you're doing yourself a disfavor if you have a strategy that you stick to, because every image deserves different edits. A lot of people say, first thing I do is hit the contrast slider, next thing I do is hit the blacks and the whites, and next thing I do is add a bit of clarity. Sometimes images don't need either of them, or just need one and the other. So when I talk about workflows, I'm talking about specific workflows to specific images and why that might be different to another image. Just because you have sliders doesn't mean you have to use them. Doesn't mean you always have to have more clarity or more sharpness or more contrast. There might be enough to start with, and adding more might actually become detrimental. So when we talk about workflows, it's image specific. You can have your own style and all your images look the same, which I would promote. You don't have to stick to a style, but sometimes it does work from one photographer to the next. But to get to that style and to have the best version of that style doesn't mean you have to have a rigid workflow. So without further ado, here's 3 images and the workflow on all 3 of them. The first image we're going to look at, I like to discuss because it has a lot to do in the chapter of avoiding just a picture syndrome, avoiding the mechanical copy, and there's a few things I did here to make sure of it. These elephants were sitting next to the river drinking. Now I was on a game viewer, and at the time I was eye level with them. I could have taken that shot. It would have been a pretty shot of some elephants drinking, but I wanted a better perspective, and that's when we go back to avoiding just a picture. One of the things we talk about is perspective, your angle, the way you look upon your subject, because that's going to be translated to your viewer. So I looked at how I could improve my perspective, how I could give the elephants more glory, more emphasis. And the only way at the time was to lower my angle. Now, sometimes you might be limited, especially in wildlife photography, limited to how much your subject moves and limited in the terms of how much you can move. You can't just get out the car in a breeding herd, they'll kill you. You can't just get out the car next to a lion with cubs, she'll kill you. And it's highly unethical, and you shouldn't do it in the first place. But there was a simple solution here. We were in the sand, we were already lower down than we would be. We actually got stuck in that situation and couldn't leave until the elephants leave. And all I had to do is hold my camera outside the door and drop my hand down. And I lowered my perspective, giving the elephants more emphasis, more glory. And it really made the image come alive. So like I said in Just a Picture Syndrome, it's so important to get the best perspective possible. And here, just by lowering my hand, I got a really good perspective. Now let's get into the edit. There's a few things wrong with this image, a few things I'd rather not have that are in the frame. If we think again back to Just a Picture Syndrome and having a minimalistic approach to your photography, which I think is so important, eliminating non-essential elements. Now, there's a number of elements in this frame, and this was as wide as I could go. Unfortunately, it included 2 elephants which I'd rather not have there. The first one being the one on the right, and the second one being the one on the left, this one. Now, the one on the right is an elephant's ass. That one on the left is an elephant's face. 2 different distractions which need different approaches. If I want to crop it out, now the first thing I want to do is unlock my crop function. At the moment, if I try and crop, it'll keep the same format like this. And I want to change the format because I like the amount of sky and I like the amount of ground. So I've got to unlock my crop function, come into the image a little bit, and if you see, if I try and crop that elephant out, I get too close to this tusk over here. So I can't crop this elephant out. I've got to decide how much elephant I want and how much I don't want, how much I can get away with. If I come to this sort of angle, which is quite a nice crop because it's balanced. If you look at the distance between this elephant's trunk and that edge of the frame and that tusk and that edge of the frame, it's quite similar. Unfortunately, if I crop it there, you can see there's just a little bit of elephant's ass. Now it's quite an obscure shape. It still is quite distracting, but not only is it distracting, it's unusual, it's confusing. There's not enough elephant ass, rump if we want to put it properly. So I know it's going to be a distraction anyway, but if my viewer is going to get slightly distracted by it, I'd rather they know exactly what it is. So I'm going to allow a little bit more of that elephant in there. Now they know that is an elephant's ass. The second problem we have is this elephant on the left. Now you can see its face is cropped out. There's a problem here. There's tusks and eye included in the frame. Now remember, we engage with eyes very strongly. So it's almost more distracting than the elephant's ass because we notice eyes, we connect with eyes. So I'd rather not have that eye there. I can't have more of that elephant's face, unfortunately, because that was the edge of the frame. So what do? I get rid of non-essential elements. I can't get rid of the whole elephant, but I can get rid of the eye, which does hold a lot of visual mass. So I crop in again, and I bring the frame just to the point where that elephant's eye is cropped out. Now it holds less visual mass. I can see now that this trunk is very close to the edge of the frame and that tusk is much further. So I think I'm actually going to bring this edge in just a little bit more, something like that. It's not perfect, but it's the best we can get it to. I'm not going to just do videos on perfect images. We're not going to learn that way. We want stuff that's a little bit more tricky, stuff that we're going to think about a bit more. And I know a lot of people say crop last. Do your crop last, recompose last. For me, it's the complete opposite. Like I've said before, composition is everything. If your composition is sloppy, your image is going to be sloppy. You can have the best edits in the world. Your contrast can be perfect, your saturation, everything can be perfect. But if your composition shit, your image is going to be shit too. I think it's better to address the things that are obviously wrong with the image. You get a better idea of where it needs to be that way. And the next thing that I think is wrong is the shadows. The picture's taken in the middle of the day. The shadows are very strong. The edges of the shadows are very strong, and those can become quite distracting. So I can't get rid of those shadows completely. It'll look fake. If I go up into the basics panel and I crank the shadows all the way up, at first you might think, oh, that helped it out a lot. But there is an element of an unnaturalness in it. Now, when I say there's an element of unnaturalness in it, some of my edits take what's natural and throw it in the bin because I've got a vision of something much bigger. I've got a fine art approach. Photography is just the medium. I don't care about what's natural. I'm trying to evoke something different. But in this particular scene, I want to keep it quite natural. It suits the story that I'm trying to go with. So I can't lift the shadows that much. I just want to get them to hold less visual mass, to be a little bit less distracting. So I lift the shadows to a point where I'm quite happy with it. Now, the next problem I see, the image is a little bit too bright, and I did that on purpose. There was no perfect ground with my exposure. If I exposed right for the tusks, the bright areas, and the sky, I had these deep shadows to work with. If I try to get rid of those shadows and overexposed, I probably would have lost a lot of detail on my elephant, and especially lost the detail in my sky. When I lose that blue, I can't use the sky anymore. When there's blue in the sky, it means you can manipulate the sky, you can do things to the sky. And my intention is to go black and white with this, a deep contrast black and white. So I want to be able to use the sky, so I purposefully underexposed so I could use that sky later and save the details on the tusks and the elephant's skin in the sky. So now that I've reserved those details, now I can come into the frame and I can get the correct exposure, underexpose a little bit, somewhere down to this point where you can see the skin is a nice color, the sky is a nice color. But I'm going to go black and white, so I want to further influence the sky, make the sky really dark so these elephants pop. That's the trick to black and white, is be aggressive, be bold, drop your blacks, use your whites, use your blacks, get bold with it, get a lot of contrast going. Otherwise black and whites look very flat. I'll show you what I mean. If I just go to the treatment panel here and click on black and white, you can see how flat this looks. It looks like shit. So I want to work with this a bit and increase the contrast globally. I go back into the colors panel. I can see I've got a lot of blues to work with over there. So I come down to the color panel over here and I select the blues. And now I can actually drop the drop the blues even further. And now obviously this looks shit, it looks unnatural. But what I'm doing is I'm building a foundation for my black and white edit. I want a lot of detail on the blues there. I want deep blues because I can work with that in my black and white edit and it's going to come out really nice. So now I think I've created a good foundation for a black and white image. I come back into basics, I click on the black and white profile. As you can see, it's still very flat. But now if I come into the black and white profile, if I come into the black and white panel down here and I select the blues and I drop them, you can see I've got a lot to work with over here. And I can make that sky deep and black and rich and make my elephants pop. Now, to some people this might go, oh, it looks a little bit unnatural, but with black and white, you've got to be bolder than just trying to stick to what's natural. You can drift over that line a little bit. It still looks natural. The sky is nice and dark. And the contrast it's creating is making my elephants pop. I think it's a little bit too dark and there's still something I need to do at the end, which I'll get to now. So I'm just going to lift those blues just a little bit more, somewhere around there. A little bit more, a little bit less, somewhere around there is good. Now the last thing I like to do with the black and white, once you think you've done enough with the sky and the elephants and the contrast, is to add a global effect. We've affected the sky separately, we've affected the shadows on the elephants separately. We can even add a little bit of clarity just like that, helps with the sky, helps with the elephants. But right at the end, what I love to do is to add global contrast. And what that does is solidify and blend all your edits. Remember, we've done that. remember we've done the sky separately and we've done the elephant separately. Sometimes there can be a little bit of an edge between them, a bit of a difference that might look a little unusual. By adding global contrast, you help blend all those elements together nice and easily. And there's two ways of doing this. If I go into the basics panel, there's a contrast slider here. I find this to be a little bit harsh on the image, and it starts to make the dark areas and bright areas a little bit too harsh. So I don't like using the contrast slider much. What's a much better way of doing it is coming into your tone curve, dropping your shadows over here and lifting your highlights over here. And now we've created a nice deep contrast black and white image. And again, people will say, oh, but you haven't done any texture, you haven't done any clarity. If I look inside this elephant, there's so much texture, there's so much clarity. You don't need it, so don't touch it. Oh, but you haven't touched the sharpening. It's tack sharp. Don't touch the sharpening if you don't need to. That's the end of the image right there. If I look at the before and after, you can see we've created a nice, deep, rich, high contrast, but smooth contrast, black and white image. The next image we're going to go to, very different approach, different image. And this is why I keep saying this idea that you have a workflow that you apply to every single image is absolute hog shit. Every image is so different. This one's got a completely different concept. So again, look at your composition. My composition is the first thing that's wrong, because if you can't fix your composition, you can't fix the picture. It goes to the trash, it's shit. So work with your composition first and you might save yourself a lot of trouble in the future. So what do? I go back to my just a picture syndrome principles and how to avoid just a picture. Minimalism, eliminate non-essential elements. Now all this sky in the background here, as far as I'm concerned, is non-essential. It's holding visual mass. This image is very imbalanced because of that sky. I don't need it, I don't want it. So get rid of it, crop in. Now because there's a lot of dust in the air, hyenas were going mad, kicking up dust, screaming, shouting, running around. There's not a lot of detail to work with. But remember what I said in Just a Picture Syndrome. Composition trumps detail every single time. Doesn't matter how much detail I have. If your composition is sloppy, your image is sloppy. So I'm fixing my composition regardless of how much detail I lose. So I come down with my composition somewhere to about there. I want to get to the point where I crop out that sky completely. If I leave a little corner in like this, that corner will be so distracting. You have to protect your corners and your edges. If there's obscure shapes or colors or brightness or darkness in the corners that don't conform with your composition nicely, those are going to be distracting. So I don't want any sky at all, not the slightest bit. I want to crop into the point where I can't see it. So right there, I've cropped out all the sky and I'm left with this image. What I don't like about this is that I've cropped out all the ribs here, which frame the hyena so nicely, so beautifully, and they're so interesting, they're full of textures. So I want to allow a little bit more in. So a 16:9 crop is going to be a little bit better, because now I can stretch this out and include a little bit more of these ribs, which are so important, just to the point where I don't get any of that background in, somewhere around here. Now it looks hazy and it looks shit. Obviously, this is where the dehaze function comes in so well. If there's any haziness from dust or humidity or mist, and you want to clear that up a little bit, what the dehaze function does, it almost works like the contrast slider. It helps remove that haze. You can see this like magic, completely gone. You want to be careful with the dehaze slider. If you go too much, you can see some areas become a little bit too dark, some areas come a little bit too bright. So don't overdo it. But we can go quite drastic on this because there was quite a lot of haze. And already you can see we've really improved the clarity of this image. Now there's a few more things I want to do. There's such interesting textures both on the hyena and on the ribs globally. Now there's no depth of field, everything is sharp. I don't have to worry about adding clarity to a milky background where I don't want it. The whole image can do with a bit of clarity. And whenever you have textures in an image, rhino skin, elephant skin, the ribs of this carcass, when you add clarity, it works so beautifully with those textures. It's clarity, remember, it deals with contrast or micro contrast in the midtones especially. So when you have textures, it's just magic. So I'm going to add a little bit of texture to this image, and you can see those ribs are starting to pop out even more. Now I must consider engagement. Remember we talked about that in Just a Picture Syndrome. I want my viewer to engage with what's going on here with the story. In this case, it's the hyena's eyes peeking through the ribs. Now my viewer is already engaged, but I think I can go a little bit further with this. So I can bring out a little bit of color contrast. There's oranges in the hyena's coat, there's reds along the ribs, and there's some very soft blues in the hyena's eyes. Now, hyena's eyes are a very, very dark blue. They're almost black. So I'm going to add a little tint of blue there and a little bit of brightness. I want my viewer to engage just that little bit more with the hyena's eyes. So if I zoom in like this, and in fact, now that I've zoomed in, I've seen there's a more pressing problem. This is the final touch that I want to do to the image. But there's something a little bit more wrong with this. You can see there's a lot of noise in the image. It was quite dark, so my ISO was very high. I want to remove that noise. It's more pressing. I always start with what is more pressing and put the final touches on top later, because if you can't fix the most pressing aspects of an image, the image goes to the trash. So I go down to the detail slider. Let's remove a little bit of noise. Take it to the point where your eyes are quite clear of noise. You can't go too much because you're going to start losing the detail on the ribs here. Now, like I've explained before, when you remove noise, you remove detail to an extent too. That's why there's this detail slider just below. Now this is such a subtle this slider is such a subtle impact. You can crank this up the whole way and you've added that detail back, and you can see your ribs are still full of detail. Let's go back into that now. We want to add a little bit of light and a little bit of color to these eyes, just to make them catch the viewer's attention just a bit more. So I put a radial filter over the eye like this, and what I do, a little bit of exposure. There's a number of ways to do eyes, lots of ways. This is the most simplest ways. Normally I like to just lift the whites, but because a hyena's eye is pure black, a very, very, very dark blue, then I just lift the exposure a little bit. When it's an eye like ours and there's a small pupil and there's a lot of white, there's slightly better ways of doing it. But with a hyena's eye, it's all black, doesn't matter. Let's carry on. And then I'm going to drop the temperature just a little bit, and you can see it's a nice soft blue. I duplicate that and I pull that onto the second eye like that. I can come back a little bit and see if that's too much. Probably a little bit too much, so we click back on the radial filter and let's take the exposure down just a touch. That one too. People will say to me, oh, they have to be exact, they have to be exact. You can see the light is falling on these two eyes differently. It doesn't really have to be exact. Light always falls on your subject quite differently. So quite often people get stuck in this trap of, oh my word, I've got to be so perfect, I've got to go around the edge. When light falls unevenly, your edges should be uneven too. The next thing I want to do is I want to pop the reds in these ribs, because red and blue, they contrast nicely together. They work really nicely together. So I go to the colors panel over here and I grab the reds over there and I crank the saturation. I see how much I can get away with. To be honest, I can get away with a lot. You can see it's added a little bit of color into those reds, which is nice and pretty. I want to get a little bit more out of those reds. I want to make those reds pop. So I've cranked my reds up in the color panel as much as I can go. So now I can use a graduation filter. Pull it over the whole image, come down here, which is a very useful thing with graduation filters. We'll go more into that at a later stage, called range mask. I can select a particular color or a particular luminance. If I click on that, you can see color and luminance. Luminance is brightness or darkness. So if I want to select the shadows, I can select the shadows. If I want to select the highlights, I can select the highlights. I'm going to go to color, and I'm going to try and select, with this little dipstick over here, I'm going to try and select these reds inside the ribs, and then I can turn the saturation up. You can see quite a lot now that I've selected a lot of those ribs. You can see that what the impact has if I go crank the saturation all the way up. Now this is a little bit too much, so I'm going to bring that down just a touch, so you can see there's a bit more reds in there. Now that meat is standing out a little bit more. I don't need these oranges in the hyena's back to be more orange. It's not important. They can be softer. What I wanted was engagement from the eyes, and these ribs played an important part of the picture. It helped frame those eyes. So I've exemplified all of those aspects. I click done and I look at the before and after. You can have a look. We have a beautiful image of a hyena. It's dark, it's twisted, but it's got beautiful colors. The story is evident. We've eliminated non-essential elements, and the essential elements we've exemplified through the eyes and through the ribs themselves. So that's the end result there. I wouldn't add more to this. Again, people might say, I'm not going into the sharpening slider and adding sharpness. The problem with sharpness is it sometimes can exemplify grain. I've already got enough of that in this image, so sharpness is not going to make an impact. The next image we're going to talk about is, again, a very different approach. Now, you can see the composition of my original image was quite sloppy, but I knew in this image that there was nothing around this leopard that I wanted to keep. I just wanted the leopard in focus. I knew I was going to crop in later and get rid of non-essential elements, minimalism. I would keep coming back to these guidelines. They're so good to help you get a good image. And one thing you must realize is your focal points in cameras, now some really modern cameras have started to fix this. It focuses better when your focal point is in the center than when it is in the edge. It grabs focus much easier. So I put my focal point in the center, because with the animal walking towards you, you're going to battle with that focus line. Quite often it'll land behind the eyes if it takes just 1,000th of a second slower to focus, that focus will fall behind the eyes. So by putting it in the center, I got the best out of my focus in my camera. And I knew I was going to crop in later, so I didn't have to compose in the scene using rule of thirds or the phi grid or whichever compositional guideline. I just wanted it in the center, and I just wanted the leopard to be in focus. When it's walking towards you, it can be quite tricky sometimes. So once again, I look at composition. If I can't fix composition, I can't fix the picture. There's a lot of non-essential elements. This grass here, there's a tree in the background. Sometimes a road works well with telling a story of movement. We went through that in the leading lines chapter. Over here, I just don't think it works very well, and I don't think I need it. I think I can simplify this image. What I want from here is confrontation. I want engagement. I've got a rare opportunity of a leopard looking straight at us, and I want my viewer to feel that engagement, to feel that confrontation. Remember, those guidelines, they don't all apply. They don't all apply to an image. Sometimes one applies, sometimes all of them apply, sometimes a few apply. In this one, I'm looking at engagement and confrontation to be my main tool of making this a very powerful image. So I really want my viewer to engage. My leopard at this stage is quite small in the frame, and then engagement's lost a little bit. Your subject should own the frame, no matter what situation it might be in. So I'm going to crop in here, crop in and crop out anything that's non-essential. So let's go to a crop function, leave it open like this. We're going to make a custom shape. Let's go in, crop out that grass right up until the edge, as much as we can lose. Now there's a number of ways we can compose this. At the moment I've got my rule of thirds grid up here, which is something that I tend to shy away from. I prefer a rule of thirds when your animal is broadside. It leaves a lot of space for the animal to walk into. When an animal's facing directly at you, I think it leaves a little bit too much space on one side of the frame. If I leave it on that rule of thirds, I think there's a little bit too much space on the right-hand side here. If I put it on that rule of thirds, again, I think there's just a little bit too much space on the left-hand side here. So when my subject is looking straight at me or angled more in my direction, I prefer the phi grid, and we'll go into the difference between the phi grid and the rule of thirds at a later stage. But for now, let's just compose this image correctly. So let's look at our composition here. I'm going to click O, the letter O, and that'll change your composition guidelines. Now, you can do this instinctually, and I usually do this instinctually. I don't actually use the guidelines, but in the beginning, they're a good thing to use. So I'm going to click O until I get to the phi grid, which is this one. Now, I love this because it centers your subject a little bit better, and the PowerPoints work the same. So I'd put my subject, which is my leopard's eyes. That's my main subject. The whole leopard is the subject, but my main subject, the pinnacle of my subject, is the leopard's eyes. And I'll put that on the phi grid, somewhere around here, on a top one, maybe a bottom one, over there. Let's have a look what that looks like. Remember, it doesn't have to be exact. Somewhere around there, a little bit more centered. I prefer that. I think it's a little bit more balanced. That might be good. There's another thing that I'm looking at here, and even though the phi grid has centered my subject a little bit more because it's facing at me, the posture is so direct that even at this stage, I feel there's too much space on the other side of the leopard, on the other side of the frame, no matter where I put it, like this. So I'm going to use another composition guideline, which is symmetry. When your subject's looking straight at you, no tail out the left, nothing different with either side of it. Sometimes a center composition works, and by trying the phi grid, I think I'm going to go for that. Now you can go to the symmetry guideline, but you really don't need it. You can go on instinct. This can help you put your subject in the dead center of the frame, and immediately I much prefer this. And again, my leopard's going downhill, so I actually want to add a little bit more space to the bottom of the frame, somewhere over there. This is a much better composition. Again, I've got a little bit of grass. It's slightly different to the other side of the frame. So I want to bring that format in a little bit closer. Now again, detail freaks will start saying, oh, but you're losing detail. A strong composition is always going to beat. I always say that, and I know I repeat it, but I really believe in it. Now I think I've got my composition sorted. There's a directness, there's balance, because my subject's facing straight at me. It's a nice center composition. So now I can look at the image and decide what I need to do next. I've cropped in quite a lot here, so I think I can add a little bit more detail and texture to the leopard's face. Again, there's a little bit of blur in the background here. I don't want detail and I don't want blur. I don't want detail and I don't want contrast there, because those details will start to hold visual mass and it takes attention away from your leopard. You want your leopard to jump out at your viewer. You don't want stuff that holds it back from doing that. By adding clarity or texture or sharpness to their blurry background, you're going to do just that. So I just want to add it locally onto my leopard. So the first thing I do, radial filter over here, pull it over my leopard's face. It doesn't have to be exact, somewhere around there. Over there, let's see where that is. If you click O, it'll show you where the mask is, straight over my leopard's face. And now there's two ways of doing this. sometimes, and some people stand by this function, is if you want it to be better, if you want it to be sharper for print, a good thing to do is actually down the texture and up the clarity, and it will appear sharper and you'll avoid pixelation. Either way you do it, you can up the texture and up the clarity. No way is wrong, it's up to you. Maybe you can add a little bit of sharpness in there through a mask. But you can see now we've added a little bit of, but you can see now the leopard's face has become a bit sharper and a bit clearer. The next thing I want to do, going back to engagement, already the posture and the directness of the leopard is, my viewer is very engaged, but we can improve it just a little bit more. All these little improvements add up to a great result. So I want to add some light to the eyes. Again, the sun was very direct, which meant the eyes were quite shadowed. We were lucky enough to just get the eyes fully open in this situation. In situations like this, the eyes are often squinted, so I want to add a little bit of brightness. Now, the most common way of doing this is adding a radial filter. Now, this works really well most of the time, and I'm going to use that technique here. But a common mistake what people do is they put a radial filter over the eye like this and make it fit as best as possible. And what they do is increase the exposure. Now, this can often get a little bit unnatural, a little bit too quickly, because it's lifting the exposure of the pupil, it's lifting the exposure of the eyelid, which is very black in the first place, so it can have an unnatural effect. What I suggest you do is rather lift the shadows. You can pump the shadows all the way up sometimes and get a much better effect, because there's some graduation in the lift of exposure. The pupils staying a little bit darker, some parts of the eye staying a little bit brighter. The edit graduates and it's slightly more uneven, which is much more natural. Once I've done that, I'm happy with that. I right click on it, duplicate, and I move the next one to the other eye. And you can see now our eyes have got impact. Our viewers fully engaged now with our leopard. If I look at the before and after, you can see a much greater impact. And this is where I leave the leopard. I might, in this situation, because of the crop, lost a lot of detail, and there's no noise I need to worry about, so I can come down to detail and add a little bit of sharpening. Remember, I almost never add sharpening to a portrait image like this. Landscapes, you can add it globally, but to a portrait image, you have to do it selectively or localized. You have to do localized sharpening. So you come to your masking slider over here and you kick that up until distinct lines. Remember, we talked about sharpening. You want to move this masking slider to the point where there's distinct lines throughout your frame. There's no sheets of white. What happens when there's sheets of white like here? Pixelation can occur. And what that is, if you think about a blurry, milky background, a sky, or in this situation, the road over here, there's no contrast there. And remember, what is sharpening? It's contrast on a micro level to a global level. So if you try and add micro contrast to add sharpening to an area where there's no contrast, what's it going to do? It's going to try and make some pixels a little bit darker and some pixels a little bit brighter to create sharpness, to create micro contrast. What that does is it creates pixelation in those areas. So you don't want to add sharpening to them. I just want it to my leopard. So if I go back to my masking slider, I want to get to the point where there's just distinct lines, somewhere around there, and I can add a little bit of sharpening. And now I've got a nice sharp leopard, as sharp as it can be. If I look at the before and after, I've got a much more confronting image. There's one last thing here. Now I've stepped back from it. There's just not quite enough space between the leopard's shoulder and the edge of the frame. So I'm just going to fix that quickly and drop the frame just a little bit. And that's about where I want it to be. So that's the end of that leopard edit. I wouldn't do more to that. And I hope you enjoyed the workflow on these 3 edits. And I hope it gives you some ideas on how to edit your images further. Hope you enjoyed. We'll see you for the next one.